In the last few hours, when I went downstairs to print out the talk that Dr. Nagesh will be giving here today, I was checking my phone and Al Jazeera, and I saw that in the last few hours alone, 6 Palestinian lives were lost, including children. And in total, since October 7, it will be around 38,000 lives, of which majority are women and children. A couple of days ago, from UNICEF report, we know that 20,000 children are missing from under the rubble, or we don't know exactly what has happened. So we would like to start in grief and in solidarity with the resistance in Palestine. So we want to observe a minute of silence in the beginning. So in grief and in solidarity with Palestinian struggle. One of the major call for global solidarity for Palestine today is to never stop talking about the Gaza Holocaust that we have been witnessing from across the world. And we at RIC struggle and try to have that conversation going every day through the hanging of the flag from our building, through organizing protest performance at RIC, and also have collective conversation around the issues of Palestinian struggle and how to build solidarity on what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. So today we have with us, as part of that process, today we have with us Dr. Nagesh Rao. He's a faculty with Independent University Bangladesh at the moment, teaching English literature, but more importantly, he's an activist scholar and political organizer for many years, and at the moment a strong voices for Palestine in Bangladesh. So thank you for making time for today's talk, for initiating this conversation on BDS movement. Before I hand over the mic to Dr. Nagesh, please turn off your phones. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Saidia Gulrukh. I'm a journalist with New Age, and I also sit one of the member of the directorial board of the RIC Picture Library. So here to you, Dr. Nagesh.
Thank you, Saidia, for first of all for inviting me to come and speak here, and thank you to DRIC for organizing this, and thank you everyone for coming out today to this event. At the outset, I want to beg your indulgence because and to forgive me for a somewhat misleading title. A better title might have been "The Politics of BDS and the History of the Struggle for Palestine." What I want to do tonight is to go back to the basics, as it were, and think about how BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, fits into the long history of the struggle for self-determination in Palestine. It goes to the question of why we are all here in the first place. What's behind the unfolding genocide in Gaza? How do we understand the rock-solid support of the United States in particular, but also of other Western governments for a genocide? I'm saying this I'm asking this question not because American support for a genocide is a remarkable thing. The US is itself a settler colony that has yet to come to terms with the sordid history of its own founding, or with the massive death toll from the wars that it has waged just in the last 50 to 100 years alone, from Vietnam and Cambodia to Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention the many bloody campaigns it has waged in its own backyard in South America, Central America, and so on. So no, US support for Israel is entirely consistent, seems quite consistent with the US's behavior elsewhere and throughout history. And yet there is a difference between, say, turning a blind eye to what was happening in Rwanda in 1994. So for people who don't know, during the Rwandan genocide, Bill Clinton's White House directed its staff, spokespersons, and so on, not to use the word genocide while speaking to the press, right? But there's a difference between sort of turning a blind eye to the genocide in Rwanda and what the US is doing today, which is actively aiding and abetting a genocide while denying that a genocide is taking place, providing repeated tranches of military shipments and aid to the occupation forces, and criminalizing any criticism of the Israeli state as anti-Semitic hate speech. So watching the horrors unfolding on social media, millions of people around the world have taken to the streets in protest, calling for a ceasefire. And yet here we are. 8 months, it's been 8 months ongoing, relentless. And there's little hope for this thing to end anytime soon. So to make sense of this madness, it's necessary to come to grips with the underlying causes of the conflict, but this can sometimes be difficult to do from a distance especially. Here in Bangladesh, things happening in West Asia, or what the US calls the Middle East, can seem quite remote. And it's easy to reach for the simplest explanation at hand, that this is a religious conflict involving the persecution of a predominantly Muslim population by Jewish fanaticism that goes by the name of Zionism. In response, Muslims around the world have rallied and are rallying behind the Palestinian cause. So that's the sort of simplistic kind of overall explanation. The recent Coca-Cola ad kerfuffle illustrates this sentiment. In video responses to the ad on social media, there have been some spoof ads in response to the ad. We repeatedly come across the same assertion. I'm going to boycott Coke because the Muslim world is doing that, because Muslims around the world are boycotting Coke. Of course, expressing solidarity with co-religionists is not a bad thing in itself, and I have nothing against that per se. But it obscures the historical and structural roots of the conflict, and it narrows the audience for the Palestinian cause. So in a sense, I think it's necessary to go back to first principles, as it were, and try to understand where all this came from and why we are where we are today. A student at IUB recently asked me why I insist on denying that it's a religious conflict. After all, if the majority of Jews in Israel and in the US, and these are the two countries with the largest population of Jews in the world, right? Approximately 7 million, 7.5 million Jews in Israel, approximately 6.5 to 7 million Jews in the US, and France, I think, is third in terms of Jewish population. So the student asked me if the majority of Jews in Israel and in the US, the two places with the largest Jewish populations in the world, support the Zionist project of establishing Jewish supremacy in all of historic Palestine, then why insist that Zionism and Judaism aren't one and the same? To understand this, it's important, I think, to look at the situation historically, because Zionism simply did not have this kind of support from the Jewish diaspora until fairly recently. Zionism emerged in the late 19th century on the fringes of European Jewish society. In much of Europe, especially Eastern Europe and Russia, in the late 19th century and leading up to the Nazi Holocaust, Jews faced relentless and often extreme forms of religious and racial discrimination and bigotry. The Tsarist regime in Russia carried out vicious pogroms against Jews. From these events, Zionists, who constituted a fringe movement at the time, we're talking about late 19th century, drew the conclusion that racism against Jews could never be ended, that Jews and Gentiles could never live together peacefully, and that therefore a separate Jewish state was needed. Convinced of the need to found a Jewish homeland in a world that was already carved up by European imperial powers, Zionists set their sights on Palestine after briefly considering Uganda and Argentina as possible alternatives. Having set their sights on Palestine, then began to mine the Bible, the Torah, and the Talmud for scriptural justifications for establishing a Jewish homeland. When in 1918, Lord Thomas Balfour declared in Parliament the British commitment to setting up a Jewish state in Palestine, it was welcomed by the Zionists, but the idea had little to no mass support. The vast majority of Jews who emigrated from Eastern Europe went to the West. They went to the UK, they went to America primarily. So, for example, in 1890, Jews in the US numbered less than 500,000 in 1890. But by 1920, there were 3.6 million Jews in the US. Before this massive immigration, 1 out of 100 Jews lived in America. That is, 1% of the world Jewish population lived in America. By 1930, 25% of the world Jewish population lived in America, 1 out of 4. I bring up these points to talk about how when Jews were fleeing anti-Semitism and racism in Europe, most of them that wanted to flee to the West. They hadn't set their sights on Palestine. The majority of them didn't see Palestine as an option. More importantly, the vast majority of Jews did not buy the idea that anti-Jewish racism could not be defeated. Rather than turn their backs on it and form a separate state, most Jews saw themselves as fighters against racism in the countries in which they lived. More specifically, they didn't look to Zionism, but to revolutionary socialism to lead the struggle against racism and religious bigotry. Because of this, politically minded Jews played active roles as founders, leaders, and activists in socialist parties in Europe. In his book, Jews and the Left, Arthur Liebman notes that socialist ideas were so appealing to Jews in Tsarist Russia that the Tsar's finance minister once bitterly complained to one of the founders of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, that Jews constituted only 5% of the Russian Empire, but they, quote, comprised 50% of revolutionary organizations at the time. At this time, the largest Jewish organization in Europe was the Jewish Bund, that was closer in spirit to the socialists than to the Zionists. In order to create an ethnically cleansed, religiously homogeneous Jewish state in a land where Muslim and Christian Arabs had overwhelmingly outnumbered Jews, the Zionist leaders had to do two things. First, they had to find a way of populating the area with Jews so that eventually Jews would outnumber Arabs. This meant that they actively campaigned against allowing Jewish refugees from the Holocaust to enter Britain or the US, so they would be forced to settle in Israel, in what was to become Israel. In 1938, for instance, David Ben-Gurion opposed a plan to allow German-born Jewish children to emigrate to Britain. Here's how he justified himself. This is 1938. This is David Ben-Gurion, quote, "If I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them to Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel." In other words, the lives of Jews who were fleeing Nazi persecution was less important than the Zionist project of setting up a Jewish state. The second thing that the Zionist leaders had to do was rely on British imperialism for support in quelling the Arab resistance and setting up the Zionist state. So the Zionists had no doubts about their relationship to imperialism right from the beginning. Theodor Herzl wrote, for example, that Israel would be, quote, "a portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia," unquote, and, quote, "an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism." So the very idea, unquote, so the very idea of the Zionist state was a mirror image of the racism that produced anti-Semitism, and it consciously saw itself as a watchdog for Western interests in the region. Actually, that should have read, sorry, so the very idea of the Zionist state was a mirror image of the white supremacism produced anti-Semitism, and it consciously saw itself as a watchdog for Western interests in the region. I want to sort of say something about the term anti-Semitism as well, because I think we've got to be very careful about how we use this term. When we're talking about European prejudices against Jews, I think it's a valid term, anti-Semitism, because it captures that dynamic. But that doesn't apply when you're talking about Arab relationship with Jews. Even if it's Arab anti-Jewish racism, we can talk about it as racism or religious bigotry, but it's not the same as anti-Semitism because Arabs are Semites too. Okay, so the very idea of the Zionist state was a mirror image of the white supremacism that produced anti-Semitism, and Zionism, the Zionist state consciously saw itself as a watchdog for Western interests in the region. The only change in this aspect of Israel that has taken place since its foundation in 1948 is that Britain, France, and the US have taken turns in holding the leash of the watchdog state. In the 1950s, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz put it this way. This is an editorial from Haaretz, 1951, I think it was. Quote, "The West is none too happy about its relations with states in the Middle East, the Arab states. The feudal regimes there have to make such concessions to the nationalist movements that they become more and more reluctant to supply Britain and the US with their natural resources and military bases. Therefore, strengthening Israel helps the Western powers maintain equilibrium and stability in the Middle East. Israel is to become the watchdog. There is no fear that Israel will undertake any aggressive policy towards the Arab states when this would explicitly contradict the wishes of the US and Britain. But if for any reason the Western powers should sometimes prefer to close their eyes, Israel could be relied upon to punish one or several neighboring states whose discourtesy to the West went beyond the bounds of the permissible." Unquote. Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands is thus intricately tied up with Western and particularly American imperialism in the region. Access to oil and control over the supply of oil has been one of the central features of US foreign policy since the end of the Second World War. And here I'm going to go into a small digression. We're going to move away from Palestine and the foundation of Palestine. We're leaving that story there at 1948. And we're just going to move a little bit to talk about US imperialism and talk about why the US, or how the US came to be such a sort of staunch supporter of the US, of Israel. At the time of World War II, the US was the largest producer of oil in the world. And just as in World War I, when Lord Curzon had proclaimed that, quote, "the Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil," so also the US's oil-producing capacity played a role in the Allied victory in World War II. But the US's search for sources of oil outside its own borders goes back to at least 1933, when the Southern California Oil Company gained a concession for oil exploration and production from Saudi Arabia. By 1941, a working paper commissioned by the State Department argued that the US should pursue, quote, "a more and more aggressive foreign oil policy aimed at assuring access to petroleum overseas." The first target of this aggressive policy was to be Saudi Arabia, which now became the linchpin of the US's interests in the Middle East. In 1943, President Roosevelt declared that the defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defense of the United States. The reason was obvious enough. It was becoming clearer and clearer that the Saudi monarchy ruled over a land that contained vast oil reserves, and as the head of the State Department's Division of Near Eastern Affairs informed Truman in 1945, quote, "In Saudi Arabia, the oil resources constitute a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in human history," unquote. In return for their loyalty to the US's interests, the Saudi royal family received billions in financial and military aid. It was the US that first established and trained the Royal Saudi Air Force and supplied the kingdom with its first combat aircraft. So the militarization of oil policy, making access to oil a national security issue and a military matter, has its roots in the middle of the last century. The period following World War II was, of course, defined by rivalry between, I thought I started my timer, I didn't start my timer. Oh, well, I hope your time. The period following World War II, which was defined by the rivalry between the Cold War superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, meant that in 1946, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff announced that it was, quote, "to the strategic interest of the United States to keep Soviet influence and Soviet armed forces as far as possible from oil resources in Iran, Iraq, and the Near and Middle East," unquote. Following this, the Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, pledged assistance to any nation threatened by communism, and it's this doctrine that guided the US's policy towards the Middle East in general. and in Iran and Egypt in particular, because anti-communism became the pretext for going after nationalist movements in the Arab world, which sought to, nationalize resources, especially oil resources and so on. So, for example, in 1951, when Iran's nationalist prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the country's oil fields and took control of the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, 2 years later, in 1953, the CIA organized a coup which overthrew Mossadegh and installed the brutally repressive regime of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But after the Shah was installed, Britain was only granted a 40% stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, with the US controlling the majority share. The Shah of Iran established a brutally repressive regime and ruled over Iran for the next 25 years as a staunch ally of the US. Similarly, in 1956, when nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launched a full-scale invasion to force Nasser to withdraw. The US actually opposed this invasion because they were worried that Nasser's Arab nationalism could spread and threaten the stability of the Saudi monarchy. But it was also an indication, their opposition to the invasion was also an indication of who was now going to be calling the shots in the Middle East. Not Britain, not France, but the US, who was going to be the key player in the Middle East. In 1957, President Eisenhower takes this a step further by declaring that the US would defend friendly regimes in the Middle East, signaling a willingness to deploy US troops in the region. So the Shah of Iran and the Saudi monarchy became two of the pillars propping up US power in the Middle East. And the third pillar of that strategy, the third prong, was Israel, which began receiving large amounts of US military aid only after it proved itself by winning the Six-Day War and showing itself capable of actually defeating a coalition of Arab states. So since the 1967 war, the US has pumped billions of dollars in unconditional military and economic aid to Israel and continues to do so to the tune of about $3.8 to $4 billion a year. That's in normal times, right? Since October 7th, Joe Biden has sent several tranches of emergency military funding and military aid. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of the different doctrines that defined US imperial policy in the Middle East. So in 1948, coming back to the formation of Israel, when Israel was formed in 1948, the Zionists captured 78% of historic Palestine. The UN partition plan had originally given Israel 55%, although Jews formed only 1/3 of the population at the time. In 1967, in 1948, they grabbed 78% of the land, even though they were actually allocated through the partition plan only 55%. In 1967, Israel attacked the surrounding states in a war, and it captured the remaining 22%. It seized the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. It seized Golan Heights from Syria, and the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Between 87 and So in 1987, fast forward, 1987, there was the mass popular uprising known as the First Intifada, which erupted out of frustration with the Palestinian, the main leading organization of Palestinian struggle, the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. The First Intifada, I would argue, it emerged out of frustration with the PLO's strategy of terrorism and armed struggle, which didn't seem to be going anywhere. On the backs of this Intifada, the PLO leadership of Yasser Arafat was able to gain legitimacy. But when the two sides came to the negotiating table in Oslo in 1993, Arafat and his cronies basically negotiated away everything except for the bare minimum. In return, what did he get? He was able to return to the occupied territories from exile and establish the Palestinian Authority with its own security and police force. As Edward Said and Noam Chomsky argued back then, this was basically a process where Israel subcontracted the task of policing the area, policing the occupied territory to the Palestinian Authority, while giving the Palestinians absolutely no control, civilian or political. The Oslo agreements were vague. They called for Israel to carry out troop withdrawals from the occupied territories in 3 phases, but they left open the question of the extent and timing of the withdrawals. And only the land that Israel seized in 1967 was up for negotiation anyway, meaning that 78% of what was historically Palestinian land, was negotiated away by the PLO when it surrendered in 1993. In either case, these phased withdrawals never took place. The third phase didn't take place. And by 1998, the so-called liberal Zionist Ehud Barak made his quote-unquote generous offer. You can actually Google, Israel generous offer, and you'll get like lists of the various generous offers that have been offered by different Israeli leaders. So Ehud Barak, made his generous offer, which was, let's just skip the troop withdrawals thing and go straight to final status negotiations of Jerusalem, right? So this was the pattern throughout the so-called peace process in the 1990s and early 2000s. Throughout the 1990s, the peace process was characterized by Israeli offers that were usually termed generous by a compliant media, but were designed to be rejected by the Palestinians, so that no real progress would be made towards a viable Palestinian state, while Israeli settlements would continue to expand. In the year 2000, the second Intifada was sparked by when the former Israeli general Ariel Sharon visited, quote unquote, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. And you can look for images and news reports of this, and you'll find, all the headlines. You can go to search for 2000 Sharon Al-Aqsa, or Temple Mount, and you'll find all the headlines say, riots sparked by Ariel Sharon's visit, and it's always his visit. It's almost like he just went, and he was like just visiting the Temple Mount, What it obscured, and all the photographs, all the media photographs, especially in the Western media, you'll find most of them are close-up shots of Sharon with 3 or 4 people around him. Yeah? But what these accounts don't tell us was that he entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound with 1,000 soldiers. 1,000 soldiers. All right. This was no ordinary visit. This was a provocation. It was a provocation designed to bring an end to this peace process that from the Israeli point of view as well, needed to be done away with. In the fighting that followed, Israel used its now familiar tactic of relentless artillery and air bombardment of refugee camps. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed, and the resistance responded with a spate of suicide bombings that took the lives of Israeli settlers. Now, for those of us involved in Palestine solidarity efforts in the US at that time, those were very difficult years. On the one hand, we were facing an establishment consensus. The establishment consensus was for a 2-state solution, the framework for which was apparently codified in the Oslo Accords. So anyone who went against the Oslo Accords was, beyond the pale, was considered extremist, disrupting the peace, that sort of thing. Every escalation in violence had been successfully blamed on the Palestinians. On the other side, while the Palestinian Authority had capitulated to the demands of the US-Israel Combine, the only ones left fighting for the occupation were Hamas and its militant wing, the Al-Qassam Brigades. Secular left organizations like the DFLP, Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, and so on, most of their cadres, most of their organization members had been, most of these groups had kind of been neutralized by repression, but also by infighting among Palestinian groups. So those of us who stood for Palestinian liberation, including the right of return for refugees, were a small minority within the Palestinian solidarity movement. To the extent that there was a solidarity movement at all in the US, we spent most of our time debunking the various generous offers made by the Israelis, but there was little to point to as a focal point for our solidarity. What were we solidarizing with? who were we looking to in Palestine to say we're with them, right? It was difficult to find some focal point for our work. The mainstream consensus, like I said, was for a two-state solution, while the one-staters, so to speak, had a politics and used tactics such as suicide bombings that we could perhaps defend when push came to shove, but couldn't possibly advocate. It was in this context, in 2005, that the BDS movement was launched. I remember well, personally, I remember well the kind of anticipation and excitement that we felt as we heard the news of the conference in Ramallah that was drafting a boycott, a BDS proposal. At the time, I was a member of Al-Awda, the Palestine Right of Return Coalition, and I was part of their international committee trying to organize solidarity work. And it was like I said, it was lonely work at the time. When the BDS announcement came out, the initial call explicitly drew parallels with the boycott of apartheid South Africa a decade or two earlier, and the call ended with these words, quote, "We, representatives of Palestinian civil society, call upon international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. We appeal to you to pressure your respective states to impose embargoes and sanctions against Israel. We also invite conscientious Israelis to support this call for the sake of justice and genuine peace. These nonviolent punitive measures should be maintained until Israel meets its obligation to recognize the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and fully complies with the precepts of international law by, 1, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN resolutions. Now, some activists at the time, I mean, I want to emphasize, like I said, it's a very difficult time for Palestine solidarity. The sort of inspiring story that we had at the time was an incredibly deeply tragic one. I don't know if people have heard of Rachel Corrie. Rachel Corrie was this college student from Evergreen State College who stood in front of an Israeli bulldozer wearing a bright orange vest, the bullhorn in her hand, trying to prevent this bulldozer from demolishing the home of a doctor. This was in the West Bank. I think this was in Ramallah, I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly where it was. I think it was in Ramallah. And the video that today we'd say it went viral. There was no such term back then. But the video showed Rachel Corrie and her comrades speaking for they spoke for about 1.5 to 2 hours using a bullhorn, trying to negotiate with trying to convince the driver of that, operator of that bulldozer, the militarized bulldozer, to stop what they were doing. And then at one point, you see in the video, the bulldozer just sort of brings the whole building, the house down on her, on top of her. And so this was the kind of story that we, this was what the Palestine Solidarity Movement could look to. Some of these martyrs, but not much more beyond that in terms of protest activity and struggle. Some activists at the time dismissed the BDS call as too gradualist, boycotting, not so glamorous, much more glamorous to protest and strike and sit in and occupy and so on. What is this boycott? It's not going to be very effective. It's going to be too gradual. But what these activists failed to appreciate, that in fact the BDS call was a strategic breakthrough in that it ruptured the consensus around two states by insisting on the right of return of refugees. As I mentioned, as a member of Al-Awda, the Palestine Right of Return Coalition. This was the only coalition of Palestinians and Palestinian supporters, the only coalition at the time that actually stood for the right of return of refugees, because everyone had accepted the status quo of Oslo. And the Oslo Accords essentially hung the refugees out to dry. So if you were for full self-determination for Palestine and the restoration of the rights of refugees and so on, you were a one-stater. You couldn't accept a two-state solution. You were a one-stater. And there was no support for that outside of a group like Al-Awda. Even today's Jewish Voice of Peace, B'Tselem, the peace organization in Israel, and so on, all of these organizations were committed to a two-state solution. So any kind of right of return of refugees became actually a very radical demand that had the ability to puncture that whole consensus. So those who sort of derided it as reformist and not too gradualist and so on, missed this element of it. And this was what excited many of us when the call came out, because it actually took up the right of refugees to return. So it was a radical demand. Because for the right of refugees to return to be successfully implemented would require a transformation of the Jewish supremacist state into a truly democratic and inclusive one. The reason why, it should be obvious why the Zionist state doesn't want Palestinian refugees to come back, right? Because it would disrupt the demographics and it would prevent Jewish supremacy from taking hold. The following year, in 2006, Hamas won the elections in Gaza and engaged in a brief tussle with Fatah over leadership of the Palestinian movement. In the end, Hamas retained control in the Gaza Strip, while Fatah remained in power in the West Bank. And with the Palestinian movement now clearly divided, Ariel Sharon, and for this, I think the PA, we have to lay the blame for this on the doorstep of the Palestinian Authority for refusing to accept Hamas's victory in Gaza Strip. And in fact, it's the PA's refusal to recognize Hamas that enabled Israel's refusal to recognize and enable the characterization of the Hamas government as a terrorist government and so on. With the Palestinian movement clearly divided, Ariel Sharon announced the so-called unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, whereby the occupation forces withdrew and subsequently encircled and enforced the tightest siege on a people in modern history. Various efforts to break the siege were met with violence by the occupation forces, such as in 2010, when the Freedom Flotilla, a fleet of ships, tried to break the siege from the sea because the attempts to send convoys by road from Egypt were failing because the Egyptian government wasn't cooperating. In fact, Egypt at the time, cooperating with the Israeli attempt to lay a siege on Gaza, closed, and I think they flooded some of the tunnels into Rafah to tighten the siege. So various efforts to break the siege were met with violence by the occupation forces. The Freedom Flotilla, led by the ship called Mavi Marmara, a Turkish ship laden with humanitarian aid, was raided and captured by Zionist forces. Several aid workers were killed, not a peep from the Western media about it. It was out of this open-air prison that Palestinian fighters broke through on October 7th to launch the attacks that triggered the current phase of Israel's genocide. From the Palestinian perspective, the current crisis must therefore appear as a confirmation of the BDS campaign's central premise that the two-state solution is a dead end, and that a just peace can only come about with self-determination for the Palestinians in the context of a single, secular, and democratic state with equal rights for all, including the right of return for refugees. Now, millions of people around the world have taken to the streets. I've just got about maybe 5 minutes more. That's okay. Okay. Now, millions of people around the world have taken to the streets to protest the brutal genocide, horrified by the images flooding their social media feeds. People might well ask, what can a boycott movement achieve in the face of the Zionist settler colonial aim to annex all of Gaza and the West Bank and to create as the right-wing Israeli government led by Benjamin Netanyahu would have it, Israeli dominance over all of historic Palestine, from the river to the sea. What can a boycott movement achieve in the face of the unflinching support given to the Zionist state by virtually every Western government, especially the United States? The BDS campaign, after all, is only one prong of a multi-pronged struggle that Palestinians have waged for their freedom and self-determination. The call itself was issued by a large coalition of Palestinian civil society, about 170 organizations representing virtually all of Palestinian civil society endorsed the initial call. It's worth noting that a call for an academic and cultural boycott of Israel had already gone out a year earlier, and the BDS campaign took this up and expanded it into a comprehensive strategy of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, modeled on the campaign that people had launched in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. The Palestinian BDS National Committee was formed to coordinate this campaign. And, in many ways, defining the role of BDS in the struggle is their job, not mine. That's why I said the title was a little, not quite the right title for my talk. I don't have the authority to define what's the role of BDS in the Palestinian struggle. So the BDS campaign has called for targeted and focused consumer boycotts of companies profiting from Israel's occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and of companies directly tied to Israel. In particular, the BDS campaign has called for a global boycott of HP, Hewlett-Packard, SodaStream, Puma, and other consumer brands. Interestingly enough, from our perspective here in Dhaka, the BDS movement website does not list Coke as one of its targets for boycott, nor for that matter does it mention McDonald's or Starbucks. But recently, it's these companies that have emerged as targets of global boycotts, fueled largely by social media campaigns. This is a reflection of the global ripples of dissent that the genocide in Gaza has set off. I know that the Starbucks boycott came out of a whole bunch of different incidents that the Starbucks company was sort of, they were firing workers for speaking up, et cetera, et cetera. So even though it wasn't listed on the BDS movement's website, these campaigns kind of spontaneously, I think, emerged and took off. In a country like Bangladesh, where we haven't seen mass protests against the genocide, we have nevertheless seen a mass response to the call to boycott Coke, and all thanks, it seems, to a single commercial. This is interesting. In the commercial, a man refuses to drink Coca-Cola because it comes from Israel. Now, the ad doesn't actually mention Israel by name, and it's worth thinking about why the territory remains unnamed. Oi jaga, well, why is that? And we can, maybe we can discuss our pet theories in discussion or over cha. The ad mocks the man's objection to drinking Coca-Cola, presenting it as merely hearsay or rumor, and the shopkeeper then schools the man on Coca-Cola's global presence. What finally convinces the man to accept the bottle of Coke is the shopkeeper's insistence that Coca-Cola even has a factory in Palestine. The backlash all over social media was immediate and unrelenting, as people pointed out that Coca-Cola does indeed have a factory in Palestine, and it is in the settlement of Atarot in East Jerusalem. Bangladeshis responded en masse, as Coca-Cola's sales have reportedly fallen by 23% in the couple of weeks since the commercial aired. In a sense, this figure offers a vindication of the boycott strategy, at least insofar as it can be seen to have an impact on the company's pocketbooks, on its profits. Now, consumer boycotts are notoriously difficult to coordinate or to sustain, and even more difficult to assess. Which is why, although the BDS campaign calls for a boycott of all Israeli products, it strategically focuses on those companies and products that have a direct hand in the occupied territories and are thus more likely to trigger mass boycotts. In addition to consumer boycotts, which one can do privately and individually, the BDS campaign calls for collective campaigns to get companies to pull out of the occupied territories. Thanks to years of organizing, companies like Veolia, Orange, G4S, General Mills, and others have exited the Israeli market because of the BDS campaigns. It's these collective efforts that are the most successful, both in terms of their impact on the Israeli economy and in terms of their capacity to mobilize and strengthen solidarity movements and organizations. In addition to these targeted boycotts, the BDS movement calls for divestment campaigns to get local universities, municipalities, banks, and investment funds to divest from Israeli companies, especially those involved in the occupied territories. Divestment has emerged as the key demand of the student protesters at campuses across the US, UK, and Canada this past year, thanks in large part to the brave students at Columbia University who launched the campus sit-in and faced massive police repression. So if you've been following the protests on social media and so on, then the slogan is probably ringing in your head too: disclose, divest, we will not rest, we will not stop, we will not rest, disclose, divest. So the disclose element of it is also really critical. Because American universities, well, disclose and divest, yeah. But in this movement, it's become clear that American universities are essentially large investment firms with an education business on the side. How else do we explain the way that they systematically prioritize the interests of wealthy investors against the well-being of their own students and faculty? With $40 and $50 billion endowments, you think about Harvard and Yale. Harvard has a $50 billion endowment. Yale has $40 billion endowment. These are massive players when it comes to investments and so on. They have American land-grant universities, land-grab universities, really. As in all settler colonies, land-grant universities are really land-grab universities. This is relevant particularly in Israel as well, and that's why, that's one of the reasons why the academic boycott is so critical. Because that is the boycott of all Israeli universities and so on is so critical. American land-grant universities have untold amounts of money invested in mutual funds and other instruments that are directly and indirectly tied to the Zionist entity. But because of a lack of transparency, it's impossible to know exactly how much and where and so on. And that's why disclose and divest has been part of the slogan. Now, one of the effects of this, of course, is, in the universities where administrators have actually conceded to protesters' demands, some universities have conceded to demands to disclose and to divest and so on, we'll now enter into a situation on these campuses where students and faculty will have some transparency. There'll be some transparency about investments and so on. So there's a knock-on effect of this movement, which is very important because it opens up the books. It creates more accountability, more transparency, more broadly and generally. The movement for divestment on university campuses has exposed both the complicity of these institutions in the ongoing genocide, as well as the degree to which local police departments have come to be Israelized in their approach to policing. This has become very clear. All the training and joint exercises and so on that local police departments have conducted with Israeli forces now, is visible on social media, as you see with the New York University encampment, the CCNY encampments. Soon after that, what happened to control these? They set up checkpoints, they set up walls, they set up fences, and precisely the way that you would expect the Zionist forces. Similarly, the demand for sanctions on Israel exposes the complicity and hypocrisy of governments that may mouth support for Palestine, but do little to stop the stealing of Palestinian lands. For example, recently there was a lot of buzz about some European countries recognizing Palestine as a member state of the UN. Such declarations and recognitions are merely performative gestures, as none of these countries has done anything to actually sanction the Israeli state. In the way, say, the Houthis have done to sanction an embargo and so on. In the US, this demand for sanctions, for divestment, and so on, forces activists to reckon with the fact that the US federal government, local governments, corporations, and educational institutions are all fully complicit in this settler colonial project, so that a lasting solution to the conflict must involve at the same time a radical critique of US economic and foreign policy objectives. Similarly, internationally, the struggle for BDS quickly forces us to confront key questions about the interconnections between our local governments, national governments, and global imperial powers and their interests like the US. The way the narrative about Palestine has been shaped by decades of Islamophobic prejudice, it forces us to confront that. And forces us to confront the need for a global solidarity movement that can do away with imperialism once and for all and guarantee the freedom of Palestinians and everyone else in a world of equity and justice. Achieving that outcome, of course, will require a sustained radical struggle built on international solidarity of workers and the oppressed. This is why we say that we need to fight to free Palestine, because Palestine will set us free.
Thank you, Nagesh. That's, how should I say, very depressing history in 45 minutes. That's a lot to take in. I'll now open the floor for questions and comments.
I now have a much better sense about sort of the thought process and the background of how the BDS movement started, what it's trying to achieve. I have a bit of a question, also something for you, maybe for your feedback. Number one is, how much do you think BDS actually touches policymakers, first of all? And secondly, in the context of the current genocide, when we're seeing such violence stream to our phones every day, is there a case for making this movement or consumer activism more aggressive? Why are we only targeting companies that are involved or are supporting the Israeli economy? Why are we not also targeting the American establishment who are actually enabling this genocide and have been enabling it for so many years? Why are we not asking or encouraging, it's not at all possible to boycott American companies or brands, but why don't we at least make the threat of doing so? Why don't we stop banking with American banks or British banks? Why are we only focused on Israel? But the first small question was, how much do you think BDS movement is affecting or touching policymakers? And the second thing I was trying to basically allude to is, why are we not taking more action to directly pressure American leadership? Let sort of the Bidens and the Trumps know that there will be trouble closer to home if they enable the bombing of children.
I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about different fractions of solidarity movements in Bangladesh. And you mentioned the Coca-Cola ad, and we were having this conversation before this talk, right? I mean, I wonder what you think about, Mojo kind of emerging as your pro-solidarity option, and then people kind of focusing on those individualistic boycott-based acts instead of building large-scale solidarity. So basically, like, what are you observing in Bangladesh at the grassroots, and do you have any critiques of it?
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really good. I was really interested about the students that you said wanted to know about religion as the cause of the conflict. And I was wondering if you could say more. How did you respond? And, what did the students leave with?
If I can just add a silly question with that, why do you think that in the ad the name of the place was not mentioned? In your analysis, why it was not named?
So I'm a literature professor, right? So I see that as a, it reveals almost the kind of insecurity of the commercial itself. Israel is already a pariah state. We can't even mention its name because, if we mention its name, then that'll sort of, it'll soil the whole ad, and it'll sort of spoil the image of the brand itself. I think so there's a kind of pariahness of the name is. I mean, I'd like to hope that's the reason, that they couldn't bring themselves to name it. I don't know. That's my theory. But some of these questions that we can. How has BDS affected policymakers? I mean, I think the first thing to say is that has clearly had such an impact that the Israeli government has set up task forces to combat it, right? So there's a task force that's operated out of, that's controlled out of Israel itself, but that works alongside the Israeli lobbying group in the US, AIPAC, to counter BDS measures. Policymakers in the US have also clearly taken note, and there have been a number of bills that have been introduced. Both, I'm not sure of the fate of these bills, but there have been bills introduced both at the federal level as well as at local and state levels, calling, specifically labeling the BDS campaign as an anti-Semitic hate campaign, right? So to the extent that touching policymakers, this is how it's touching them. And you can tell that, if they're going after a boycott movement this way, they're worried, So to the other question, why not, escalate tactics and target the US, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, there's no, I don't think the BDS movement is necessarily against, broadening the targets of boycott efforts and so on. But from the standpoint of BDS, it has, their strategy is to have targeted campaigns that can have maximum impact, that kind of thing, right? But beyond BDS, we've got to think about creative ways in which we can hold, yeah, absolutely, U.S. government, U.S. Companies that are associated with or profiting from the occupation and so on, find ways of holding them accountable. Absolutely. And in the West, of course, this in the U.S. and in the UK and so on, this has taken various forms. So that, some really militant actions have taken place at Elbit Systems in the UK, for instance. Activists have gone and actually raided and destroyed factories of Elbit Systems, which is a supplier of military hardware and parts. So there are those sorts of actions and activities taking place. Now, here in Bangladesh, what can we do, right? And I think our main efforts have to be to twofold. One, holding the U.S. accountable means, I think, mobilizing, protesting, and so on at the U.S. Embassy, like we've done. We've had one protest of that kind so far. More of those, more larger ones, would be a good thing. But also, we have to break the logjam of consciousness in Dhaka and logjam of silence around Palestine. So, as to the question, like what's happening at the grassroots and what are the students saying, et cetera, I feel like there's a, and this is my impression, and I could be wrong, and I'd be happy to be corrected on this. My sense is that for a layer of secular-minded middle-class folks, the people that I'm sort of most in touch with, there is an association, an Islamophobic association of the Palestinian struggle with Islamist movements, that this is really about Hamas, this is really about terrorism, this is really about, and my student, actually one of my students explicitly said that when they tried to protest outside the university officials, who shall remain unnamed, apparently sort of, wagged their finger and said, don't do that, Jamatis are doing that, you're being Jamaat, that sort of thing. So I said, well, you should have responded, so what? It doesn't matter who I am, I'm protesting a genocide. It doesn't matter who I'm, so there's that element on the one hand. On the other hand, it's, it has to be, it has to be challenged, it has to be questioned, and it has to be debunked, right? So this association, which creates a kind of self-censorship, because people don't want to be somehow associated with the struggle for Palestine, because that seems to align yourself with a kind of religion-based politics that you may not agree with. So there's that kind of reluctance. And I think we have to break through that. We have to have more conversations. We have to have more debate, discussion in the open about what's going on. Yeah, so I'll stop there. And other questions, comments? And, I would encourage people to sort of take issue with what I've said, and or just sort of, put your own thoughts out there as well, your ideas, so that it's not just, I don't want to present myself as a sort of expert. Like, this is part of this is about, kind of putting our heads together and figuring out what's, what we can do and so on. So.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Nagesh Rao. It's been a fascinating summary. Basically, you summarized a very complex issue in a very simple, easy to sort of recognize narratives. Fantastic. Just a couple of comments. I think my background is basically in the corporate world. I've been in the corporate world for about 15 years. Now I'm a businessman working in real estate and consulting. Just a few comments before I move on to the question that I have. One of the comments that came in repeatedly is the Coca-Cola ad. I have been a faculty of brand management for quite many years in several universities. One of the comments that I have on this issue is that it's stunning that the Coca-Cola global Coca-Cola company allowed such an ad to actually be aired or even produced in a country like Bangladesh. I think that was one of the most shocking things that I could have seen. And the fact that they were ready to experiment with such a thing. Several things that had happened prior to that, because a lot of people are interested in Coca-Cola, is that first of all, the Bangladeshi distributorship business was handed over to a Turkish company prior to that, which is why they were talking about Turkey all the time in the ad. And the second thing that they did was they changed the CEO to my classmate and alma mater, who had a religious outlook. So these are the things that have happened prior to them airing and producing this particular ad. And the ad itself, I think the two trigger, I think one of the small edits I would like to make to the comment on the reaction of the ad itself. The reaction actually happened before the ad was aired, which is Coca-Cola Bangladesh had already lost 35% of its market share already to competition, which is why it was a desperate move to regain some part of that on the eve of Eid. They're playing that we can't lose this market on the eve of Eid. Once they did that, unfortunately, what happened was, beyond just Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola bottle, people started commenting on, okay, what are the other sister juices that they make? So Aquafina came up. Then you have Pepsi that came up, and everyone suffered because of that. And the main arrogance that came through the Coca-Cola ad was that they thought people were stupid. They would not search, and they would not find out things like BlackRock and Vanguard through that search. And then the movement starts to go really, really big. And one of the comments was the US connection with the entire movement. And that's where people's consciousness, okay, Israel is not an independent pariah state. US is an integral part of the Zionist movement. That kind of virality that this resulted has created this organic growth of animosity towards this entire Western colonial mindset. And I think that has been a very positive outcome since then. The question that I have on this front, which I really am struggling to find an answer to, is whenever we think about boycott as a strategy, one of the fundamental problems we have is finding substitutes. What is the substitute of Microsoft? What is the substitute of Intel? What is the substitute of Hewlett-Packard? What is the substitute for the government perspective, spying software that we need? Everything comes from a central location. And one of the reasons why we've become so attached to this is because we've basically sold our economy to the West, and so many countries have. And we've not become independent in our economy, social structures. We rely on the West so much. And this was an opportunity to do so. Unfortunately, we've cut ourselves on the foot when it comes to our own economy and made some terrible, terrible decisions. How do we come out of this? Is there some kind of a discussion or a movement happening that transforms the economy of Bangladesh to become independent, which is something that we are struggling with? Yes. Thank you.
I mean, I think boycott alternatives, I mean, that's part of the problem with the boycott strategy, right? Finding alternatives, because it's this, it's almost as though if you say you should, you call on someone to boycott something, you have to provide them the alternative, and it's like, no, that's not my responsibility. It's your responsibility to figure out how you're going to do without, right? It's not about, boycotting is not about finding a nice substitute. It's about doing without, to support a particular cause, that sort of thing. But I also think that this is the limitation of consumer boycotts, right? So while individuals might decide to forego or substitute or whatever else it might be, it's difficult to coordinate and sustain that in any systematic way. This kind of spontaneous sort of explosion, you can't actually engineer that, right? So that's why I think these need to be seen not as strictly consumer boycott, or in the vein of collective mobilizing efforts, right? Because that's what it'll take to. So, for example, take the boycott of HP, Hewlett Packard. Right? Is the goal best served by individuals checking their own, laptop bags and so on, and seeing what computer do I have, or is it best served by thinking about which are the large institutions, banks, educational institutions, et cetera, that use HP as their main platform, buying 200, 300 laptops or whatever, you know what I mean? And targeting those companies and trying to get them to boycott. And in boycott almost becomes indistinguishable from divestment, right? It becomes that kind of campaign. Yeah, in terms of the rest of what you said, I mean, to some extent I agree about the kind of economy sold out to the West, that sort of thing. But at some level, it is an integrated world economy. There's no going back to kind of nationally enclosed spaces without reactionary politics along with it. And so and within that integrated world economy, there's inequality and hierarchy, et cetera, defined by imperialism internationally and by class domestically and other factors. And so, it has to be part of our struggles. Have to kind of take all of that into account to change things. And that's a broader question about revolutionary transformation of all social structures, right?
Thank you, Nagesh. It was simply brilliant. So my question has to do with whether you have any thoughts on the Bangladesh government's position vis-a-vis the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. It's not a conflict, obviously, it's a genocide. And whether you have noticed any shifts in the Bangladesh government's position pre-October 7th and onwards. Okay. And just two things I would like to mention just to sort of help out the conversation. And one has to do with the passport. You know how earlier we had no countries of the world. Israel was in the ban. And the second thing has to do with planes from Tel Aviv having landed at Dhaka airport, and that was during the last Eid holidays. Thanks.
Yeah, those are the two things that I've heard, and I would like explanations and so on from you, really, because that's what I've heard about, and the thing about planes landing and so on, which almost are those rumors that actually happen. What does that signify, especially given that the government on the world stage has been active and vocal on one level in support of Palestine, if not active, at least vocal. So I don't know what I'd like to hear. Yeah, maybe this is a conversation that we should have, I guess, about where exactly things stand with the Bangladeshi government's policy.
The third thing that I forgot to mention was the Pegasus software that the Bangladesh government is reported to have bought via third party from Israel.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Okay.
That's in an Al Jazeera report. It came out in an Al Jazeera report a year ago.
Well, Pegasus, of course, is that software that the Indian government also used to target all the activists who got caught up in the Bhima Koregaon raid and who were then imprisoned and so on the basis of this falsified stuff. Pegasus software is not only for surveillance, but you can also implant stuff on people's phones and so on. So this is, I mean, obviously this is the relationship that's been built between India and Israel will have knock-on effects, I think, on other countries in the region and their relationship to Israel, perhaps. And maybe this is part of that transformation. I don't know, the violation state, all the steps of India's alignment with Israel, perhaps. And of course, that software has been very useful for all sorts of locally. The fact that India was shipping bombs and drones to this wouldn't have made the news if it weren't for Spain interdicting one of those ships and preventing it from because it wasn't in the Indian media. No one would have heard about it even. So yeah, I mean, this is a reflection of how Israel's relations with the subcontinent have transformed pretty dramatically over the last, I want to say 10, 15 years.
Authoritarian governments are dependent on Israel for surveillance tools, and that is how these links and connections are being made. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
I'll just add one more. I was wondering if you have any insights specifically about financial institutions under BDS. I think Barclays was maybe one of the banks, and maybe there's a few more. How effective those were. And secondly, one notion that I've been sort of mulling is, again, with the idea of putting pressure on British and American governments, not necessarily individual companies. What might the effect be if we stop banking with sort of British and American banks? So if, say, people would start a charter accounts, decided that I don't need to change my habits, I just need to withdraw my money. Or people, HSBC accounts said, we don't want to bank with British or American banks, or engage with the financial system to whatever extent possible. What kind of pressure might that create?
America was on the target. America was on the list. I mean, in the US, as far as I know, there have been many, sort of like calls for bank boycotts. Never really taken off. And those are very difficult to, to sustain, to even get off the ground, So yeah, I mean,
consciously changing a consumption behavior, you have alternative banks, but I know the truth that, getting something to scale and sustain is very difficult.
Yeah. And, I mean, the struggle right now is really at a different stage, right? I mean, people are occupying, whether it's campuses, whether it's public spaces, they're disrupting political events. So this is a stage where, we're moving, like you said, escalating to things like disruptive activities, right? Civil disobedience, blocking roads, blocking bridges, that sort of thing is what's going on all over the US. And to some extent in the UK, I guess. But yeah, here I think, our ability to sort of have any kind of impact is dependent on mass mobilization in a way that will force the embassy to sit up and take notice. We're not there yet. I think we need to get there.
Are there any more questions?
I think I'll just make a comment on the silence in Bangladesh surrounding issues of Palestine, and how we repeatedly hear that it's the fear of not getting visas which is preventing people from speaking up. And I think I'm concerned about it because I don't have a sense of how pervasive that is. How likely is it that people will be actually applying for visas? And how is it that visa fear feeds into this decision to remain silent? And as I think about that, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and I wonder how this entire university education, higher education in the U.S. programs that we see everywhere. You look up at newspapers, there are ads of go study abroad, study in the U.S., scholarships here or there. The role of the various institutions like the EMK Center, like the embassy, working everywhere, at least gives the impression that everybody has the opportunity to go to the United States. Not that they actually do, but in terms of formulating public opinion surrounding why is it that I will stay quiet, that maybe one day, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I will get the opportunity to, I don't know, get a scholarship to go and study, in which case I will not get a visa if I am seen as a pro-Palestinian activist. And I wonder whether, you can speak to it and others can speak to it, but how is this, I don't know, is it that there are already visa sanctions that feeds into this fear? Why is it this fear of visa so pervasive that it has effectively silenced mobilizations surrounding Palestine?
Hi. I think something that just crossed my mind in relation to that last question was I was also thinking about the context here and the silence surrounding, especially after October 7th, although I would argue that, of course, the government itself and the state mechanism that we have here had, I would say, quite successfully cashed it in leading up to the January 7 so-called elections. Vis-a-vis its need to present and frame it itself as a staunch anti-imperialist force against what it deemed U.S. intervention. And of course, as Renu has pointed out, there's the rampant use of surveillance technology from Israel, RFID chips brought in to support the Rapid Action Battalion. And of course, thankfully, I notice schools of thought emerging where we're finally being able to analyze the state of Bangladesh structurally as also being a Zionist state. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, you don't have to be an adherent of Herzl or having anything to do with the historicity of it, but rather structurally as being a monolithic nation state or its relationship to the people living within its borders, particularly as we know of the persecution of the bomb civilians in the CHT that is going on right now. That being said, I think part of what I was thinking about your talk was about this idea of trying to understand boycotting or investing on what I would call like very individual levels, because we were talking about the silence, and there's also, I think, another factor that is for a lot of people who would rather speak out. It's also, I think it's because in many ways, particularly the West, the United States, Germany, France even, if you look at that, if you look at the G7 countries, those are really coincidentally also the same states that have come to strategically position themselves as, if not the singular ally of multiple marginalized communities. So what we have here is a constellation of struggles that are extremely confined and patronized within the diplomatic zones of Dhaka. And I feel like part of the silence there and part of the aversion there has to do with them worrying that the funding might stop. And I think part of my question there is also this dilemma that a lot of my friends and a lot of colleagues have about, taking on work or taking on grants from FJS or becoming a Rockefeller Fellow, and whether, what Ruth said, by talking back, taking their money and using it to tell your story, whether that holds any merit at this current time. I'm sorry, just dumping all of my thoughts onto you. That's kind of what I would like to hear.
No, I think this is it's the fascinating conversation and comments. On the I'll just address the visa issue and then I'll that, because I think on the visa question, this is clearly an issue, at least on campuses, from what I've seen, and why are people so scared? I'm new to Bangladesh, so I can't really say why people are so scared. But I'll say this: the U.S. is not as efficient as people think it is. They're not so efficient. They're not so, it's sort of like people, I'm sure many of us think maybe Israel sort of, saw this attack on October 7th coming, and this was part of a conspiracy to let them do it so then we can go. And maybe that's true, but it's also likely that they're just incompetent, and I think we have to accept some of that. Some of that incompetence is actually natural, it's inbuilt, and they're not actually able to keep track of everything that they say they're going to keep track of. So I don't know. I mean, I'm less inclined to shrink in the face of thoughts of US retaliation. But then I don't have any visa problems because I have US citizenship. So, I don't have that issue. So, I can't really speak to those who feel that fear, except to say that, I feel it's largely unfounded. I feel it's largely based on the kind of the experience of repression at home and the degree of surveillance and so on at home has made people wary of taking on, forces abroad. I don't think the US is as efficient at policing Bangladeshis as the Bangladeshi government is. And I also think that given the Bangladeshi government's sort of at least vocal support for the Palestinian cause, this is an opportunity. It offers an opportunity to push for all sorts of things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc., in the name of a cause that possibly go against, right? And it's an opportunity. I think to bring that idea that fighting for freedom for Palestine, through that we'll free ourselves. Once we bring that idea into our work, then I think it becomes more logical and more organic so we can think about the connections between that struggle and this struggle, and how do we make it happen. And on all these questions and the questions that you raise, I have no answers, and these are things that it's a fascinating discussion that I'd like to be part of, So let's talk more.
Last question. Ekhane.
I'm just piggybacking what you just said. I guess US definitely is not as smart as we think, but it's very efficient in creating and circulating a culture of fear. And here, perhaps students, the threat that students are facing, I think is probably an extension of the threat international students are facing within the boundary of the United States. Specifically, Donald Trump just said that he would like to offer green cards to everyone who graduates from an American college except for Hamas supporters. And then there were a few other categories, right? So international students in the United States are also under that constant threat that doing anything pro-Palestinian, also known as pro-Hamas, is going to affect their immigration status, which I would probably argue, that gets translated like outside of the United States. And here in Bangladesh, there are numerous Facebook groups where students would go and they would post scripts of visa interviews, the way they had a conversation with the visa officers. Other students would read that scripts and learn about the embodied performance that's expected within that space of the embassy. So US visa interview itself, it's a very stressful embodied performance that students in Bangladesh has to face. So yeah, I guess I would just say that, I mean, it might be helpful to kind of look at this incident as an extension of what's happening within the boundary of the US as well.
I want to add to that. I think the culture of silence on campuses, I think relates not so much to student or even faculty fear of visas and so on. It really relates to institutional fear of losing grants and funding opportunities, et cetera, more sort of institutional macro scale relation US. And so that kind of fear at the administrative level then kind of trickles down, because that's the attitude or the culture that's then fostered on the campus itself. So I think that's part of it too.
So when you apply for US visa, you probably have to give away your social media handles, which obviously, kind of creates that, panic about, oh, they're going to surveil me, no matter whether they actually do or not.
Yeah, I don't want to minimize the fear. I mean, I think the fear is real and, to some extent legitimate. Surveillance and policing of ideas has become so much a part of our lives on the subcontinent. I remember, like, many years ago when I was in India and I was going back to the US, I was taking a few books back, and I had to declare at customs what the books were, and I had to sign a declaration that there were no books on India. I was like, "What are you talking about? There's a whole box full of books on India. Why can't I take books on India?" Oh, then he changed it to no books against India. So I said, okay, no, and signed it. But that, that filter is there is a problem. But the fact that it gets incorporated into a bureaucratic mode of operating where it's just another rubber stamp, eventually you get it, that's a whole different, that's also there. So.
Do you have any concluding thoughts that you want to add before we?
Onward with the no. No, I mean, thank you all for coming out. I think this is an ongoing conversation, and I'm glad this is that we had this, and I hope going forward we can actually think about some sort of large, visible, vocal action that will, take us to the next step in our mobilization.
Before we conclude,
yeah.
Sorry. I have a few things that I really want to say. First, I think we're at a historical moment when we do need to face this culture of fear that we're talking about, and at the risk of sounding righteous, I do want to say that if you see that US visa or any Western countries are asking you to declare your social media handle, we do need to collectively ask questions. When United States are supposed to be the flag bearer of freedom of expression, we probably can't do it individually, but at a moment when US university students are doing what they're doing, as we see, like facing the worst possible, like fierce, violent police forces in the world, and we have to make those ethical questions. Individually, when you're talking about visa fear, these are questions of individual privileges and future. What we're seeing unfolding right before our eyes, as I was saying, that in the last few hours before we all sat together to talk about Palestine solidarity, 5 Palestinian lives were lost, including a child. We need to ask these ethical questions. And thank you, Nagesh, for this really, as Renuma said, simply brilliant, and it probably wasn't easy, because as I was listening to you, I was fidgeting with anger. I don't really have the emotional tenacity to go through the history of this kind of violence and state violence that has been going on for more than 75 years. And also I would like to briefly mention, as Sairat has referred to, that this history that you were talking about has a lot of parallel with the history of Chittagong Hill Tracts, where there was also a treaty, CHT Accord, signed and betrayed, and the signing party has been on the streets demanding the implementation of the accord itself, and there are groups that are asking for full autonomy, and right now as we speak there is a slow ethnic cleansing going on against a particular group. Bomb communities are faced with everyday persecutions. So that when we talk about Palestine and Palestinians, our solidarity with struggles in Palestine, we must also be able to connect with state repression, state violence in CHT. And along that line, I would say that when we're talking about BDS movement, that recently it has added another D, the disclose, and we should keep asking Bangladesh government in what process that the government has made that decision to remove the sign that any state except for Israel, that Bangladeshi can travel with this passport. We demand an answer from the government. We want to know, we want the government to disclose the deals the trade deals through which they are buying surveillance technology, including Pegasus, and there was another that they brought for the digital forensic department earlier. And we also want to know what happened in April when a plane from Tel Aviv came to Dhaka. So it doesn't always have to be on the streets. In social media, there are questions that we need to ask our government, that it has rightfully appropriated the Palestinian cause before the election, but it seems like it is changing its foreign policy towards Israel. So we should demand answer from our government to start with. If we are to form a BDS coalition in Bangladesh, the first thing that we need to consider is to ask the government to disclose information on its relationship, on its foreign policy with Israel. Thank you so much, Nagesh. We have some refreshments outside, and there is a talk tomorrow on GI and India's claim to our Tangail sari. So you're all invited. See you tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you.